A man who lives off his wife doesn't get to have an opinion. There are forged signatures on these documents. I will not be signing anything. Sign it and walk out. Don't make me say something worse. No one knew that Damian was the one. He owned all the money that helped them survive. My name is Damian Reed. I'm 38 years old. And for the past 7 years, my wife's family has believed I was a failed financial consultant who couldn't hold down a job. I drove a used car. I wore clothes that didn't announce anything. When Rachel's family gathered for dinners and celebrations, I sat at the far end of the table and didn't talk much about what I did for a living because the answer was complicated in ways I wasn't ready to explain. Over time, they filled in the silence with their own version of me, a man who lived in his wife's shadow, contributed little, and had no business sitting at the same table as the Carter family. I let them believe it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that when the time was right, everything would become clear. What I didn't tell myself, what I refused to look at directly, was that Rachel had stopped defending me long before any of this began. There were small things I noticed and chose not to name. She stopped introducing me to her colleagues because, as she once said, she didn't know how to explain what I did. She kept a separate bank account and handled the family's financial plans without consulting me, even the ones that affected both of us. At family gatherings, she sat beside her mother and Tiffany instead of beside me. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be called a fight, just consistently enough that it became the shape of things. When Tiffany made a cutting remark about me at the dinner table, Rachel didn't push back. She changed the subject. I told myself that was just how families worked. That she was keeping the peace. That she loved me in the ways that mattered even if she didn't always show it in public. I was wrong, but I wasn't ready to be wrong yet. The truth I was protecting her from was this. I am the founder and controlling shareholder of North Star Meridian Group, an investment logistics and technology conglomerate currently valued at just over $50 billion. My father built the foundation of it. I built the rest. And when he was killed in a kidnapping that was specifically tied to our family's assets, I made a decision that changed every relationship I would ever have afterward. I buried my name. I restructured my ownership through a series of trusts and holding entities, surrounded myself with a legal team sworn to confidentiality, and stepped back from every public-facing role the company had. Only a handful of people knew the truth. A few attorneys, 2 members of the board, and my CFO. Everyone else, including my wife, knew a version of me that I had carefully constructed to be forgettable. I told Rachel before we married that my finances were complicated and that there were things I couldn't disclose for security reasons. She signed the prenuptial agreement. She said she understood, but understanding something in theory and living beside it for 7 years are very different things. And by the time we reached that party, I think Rachel had long since decided that security reasons was just a polished way of saying I had nothing worth securing. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was what I had been doing with that wealth in the years we were together. When the Carter family's furniture company nearly collapsed under its debt load, an anonymous investor stepped in and restructured the financing. That was me. When Ella, Rachel's mother, needed extended inpatient care after her cardiac episode and the medical bills began piling up, someone paid them in full. That was also me. When Tiffany launched her first restaurant and couldn't secure enough capital to get past the first 6 months, a private fund provided a bridge loan with terms no bank would have offered her. That was me, too. I kept the Carter Company's workforce intact through a quiet arrangement that the family attributed to good luck and better management. They thanked no one in particular because they didn't know there was someone to thank. I watched them celebrate their own resilience and said nothing. I thought I was being patient. Looking back, I think I was being a fool. The party was held at a venue the Carter family had rented for the occasion. White tablecloths, hired servers, the kind of event designed to look like success before success had actually arrived. Tiffany and her fiancé, Gavin Price, were announcing their new resort development project. There were speeches planned, champagne, a short presentation with projected returns that I recognized immediately as inflated. I sat near the back and watched the room fill with people who believed in Tiffany, the way people believe in something beautiful before they've looked closely at the structure holding it up. The problem surfaced when Tiffany pulled me aside before the program started and placed a document in my hands. She needed a $60 million loan. The bank required collateral. She wanted to use the house where Rachel and I lived as the secured asset. She believed the house belonged to Rachel. It did not. It was purchased prior to our marriage and held in a trust under my name. I was the only person who could authorize any transaction tied to it. I told her I needed to review the full contract before I could discuss anything further. She handed it to me with the confidence of someone who had already decided the conversation was a formality. I read through it carefully, and what I found turned my stomach. The project valuation had been manipulated. A portion of the loan proceeds were routed to offshore accounts I didn't recognize. And on the signature page of a supplementary authorization document, I found my own name signed in a hand that wasn't mine. Gavin had also prepared a power of attorney bearing Rachel's name that I was certain she hadn't signed herself, or if she had, she hadn't understood what she was authorizing. I told Tiffany I would not be signing anything, and that I intended to contact the bank directly to flag concerns about the documents. That was when the evening changed. She didn't argue quietly. She pulled the contract out of my hands and turned to face the room. Her voice landed across every conversation like a door slamming open. "This man has been living in my sister's house and spending my sister's money for 7 years," she said loud enough for every person in that room to orient toward her. "And now he wants to stand here and tell this family what we can and cannot do. A man who lives off his wife doesn't get to have an opinion." I said nothing. I kept my expression still. That was when she hit me. The sound of it silenced everything. I felt the corner of my lips split, tasted blood. I didn't move. I stood exactly where I was and let the room absorb what had just happened, because I had learned a long time ago that the person who stays still in a moment of chaos is always the one people remember more clearly afterward. Then Rachel stepped forward. I watched her cross the room. I told myself in the 2 seconds it took her to reach her sister's side that she was coming to intervene, that she was going to put her hand on Tiffany's arm and say that was enough. That 7 years of marriage meant something that would be visible right now in this moment when it mattered most. She stopped beside Tiffany and looked at me. "Damian." Her voice was even controlled, the voice of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. "Sign the documents or pack your things and leave my house tonight. Those are the only 2 options on the table." I looked at her face for a long moment. I looked for something. Hesitation, conflict, the flicker of a woman who had not entirely made up her mind. There was nothing. Her expression was settled in the way that things are settled when a decision was made somewhere private long before it became visible to anyone else. I reached down and took off my wedding ring. I set it on the table between us. I walked out of that room without saying another word, and I did not look back. In the car, I sat for a long time without starting the engine. I had enough power to end Tiffany's project before morning. One call to the right person and the loan would evaporate, the bank would open an inquiry, and the entire Carter family would spend the next several years in legal proceedings. I could have done it from the parking lot. I didn't. Not because I was weak. Not because I forgave anything that happened in that room. I didn't act because I had learned over many years of running a company worth $50 billion that decisions made in the first hour of rage almost always create problems that take years to clean up. I called Marcus Webb, North Star's general counsel, and told him to open a quiet investigation into the project, the principles involved, and the origins of the forged signature on that document. I told him I also needed to know exactly how deeply Rachel was connected to what had happened. The answer came back before I had finished unpacking the one bag I had taken from the house. Rachel had been sending copies of my personal documents to Tiffany for months. Identification, electronic signature samples, property records, everything Tiffany would have needed to fabricate an authorization in my name. Rachel hadn't simply failed to stop her sister. She had handed her sister the tools to do it. She had been doing it deliberately over time in the quiet of our shared life, while I sat at the far end of the table and told myself the distance between us was something that would eventually close. I stood in the middle of that small apartment with my phone in my hand and understood that I had two choices. I could go public, reveal who I was, use the full weight of what I had built to flatten every person who had touched this and leave nothing standing. Or I could stay quiet, keep gathering evidence, and make sure that when the moment of reckoning came, it landed on the right people for the right reasons in a way that the law could hold and a courtroom could confirm. I chose the second path, not for Rachel, not for Tiffany. I chose it because there were thousands of people who came to work at the Carter Company every morning and had no idea that the people running it were criminals. They didn't deserve to lose their livelihoods because of someone else's greed. If I was going to act, I was going to act in a way that protected them. From that night forward, I wasn't fighting to save my marriage. That was already over. I was fighting to make sure the right people faced consequences and that the people who had done nothing wrong didn't end up paying for it. By the following morning, I was already villain. Tiffany had posted a video before midnight. She had edited it down to 11 seconds, just long enough to show me grabbing her wrist after the slap, my face tight, my grip visible. Everything before that moment had been cut away. There was no context. There was no slap. There was only a man's hand closing around a woman's wrist at a family gathering and a caption that read, "This is who my sister has been living with." Within a few hours, it had been shared several hundred times. By the next afternoon, strangers were leaving comments about men like me, controlling, volatile, the kind who hides what he really is until someone finally exposes him. I read the comments once, then I put my phone face down on the counter and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the day. Rachel filed for legal separation 2 days later. In her declaration, she stated that I had a pattern of applying financial pressure within the marriage, that I withheld information about shared assets, created a climate of economic instability, and used control of household finances as a form of coercion. Every word of it was a careful inversion of the truth. I was the one who had never touched her money. I was the one who had quietly funded the survival of her family's business, paid her mother's hospital bills, and floated her sister's restaurant through its first shaky year. And now, those same acts of support were being rewritten as evidence of a man who manipulated the people around him for personal gain. Elaine changed the locks on the house the same week. She left my clothes in 2 garbage bags on the front step with a handwritten note that said the property belonged to her daughter and that I should not return. I stood on the curb and looked at those bags for a long moment. I knew the house was mine, held in a trust that predated my marriage by 4 years, structured in a way that no court would misread. I could have had a property attorney on her doorstep within the hour. Instead, I picked up the bags, put them in the back of my car, and drove to the apartment I had already arranged. I needed that house to stay exactly as it was, occupied and undisputed, while the investigation moved forward. Disrupting the domestic situation would have created noise I couldn't afford. Marcus' team was moving quickly. Within the first week, they had assembled a picture of the Carter Price operation that was significantly worse than what I had suspected in that parking lot on the night of the party. Tiffany had not run a clean business at any point in the past 3 years. There were 2 prior projects, a boutique hotel development and a commercial property renovation, where investor funds had been drawn down well beyond what the project costs could justify. The excess amounts had moved through a sequence of transfers that ended in accounts connected to Gavin's consulting entities. Gavin had set up 4 separate companies, all with professional-sounding names and registered addresses that turned out to be mailboxes. He had billed consulting fees to every project Tiffany touched, and those fees were consistently the last payments processed before the projects ran dry. The man was systematic. He had been doing this long enough to have developed a rhythm. The $60 million resort loan wasn't an ambitious new venture. It was an exit strategy. A portion of those funds, if released, would have been used to quietly settle Gavin's outstanding gambling debts. Debts that were, according to what Marcus' contact pulled from a private collection proceeding, substantial enough to have attracted the attention of people who didn't send polite letters. The rest would have padded accounts in two jurisdictions that don't cooperate easily with American financial regulators. If I had signed that document, or if they had succeeded in forging enough authorization to push the loan through without me, the money would have been largely unreachable within 72 hours of disbursement. And the Carter Company, the one I had rescued from collapse years earlier, the one that employed thousands of working people across 3 facilities, was once again in serious financial trouble. Not because of bad luck, because Gavin and Tiffany had been systematically draining resources from it through their network of inflated contracts and ghost payments. The people on the floor of those facilities had no idea that the ground beneath them was giving way. They showed up every morning and did their jobs and trusted that the people above them were doing theirs. That was the part I couldn't let go of. Not the slap, not the forged signature, not even Rachel's declaration. It was those people. I called Marcus and told him to set up an emergency payroll protection fund structured through a third-party trustee with no visible connection to me. Enough to cover 2 full payroll cycles for every employee at every Carter facility. If things went sideways before we reached the courtroom, those workers would not be the ones absorbing the impact. Marcus asked if I was certain I wanted to do that while I was simultaneously under investigation. I told him I had never been more certain of anything. He set it up by the following morning. The recording came from a member of the venue's security team, a man named Dennis, who had worked private events for 15 years and had a habit of keeping full audio backups of every room he monitored for liability reasons. He'd learned the hard way after a client dispute years earlier. He reached out to Marcus directly after seeing the edited video circulating online. He said it didn't match what he had heard that evening. He handed over the full file without asking for anything in return. I listened to it alone in the apartment with the lights off. Tiffany's voice was clear. She and Rachel had been in the holding room off the main hall approximately 40 minutes before the confrontation. Tiffany's tone was practical, the tone of someone going over logistics, not working herself up. She said she was going to push me publicly. She said, if I kept my composure, they'd have a problem, but if I reacted physically, they'd have everything they needed. The video, she explained, would be Rachel's strongest asset in the divorce evidence of a volatile husband grounds to challenge the prenuptial agreement on the basis of coercion and emotional abuse. And if the loan eventually came under scrutiny, a documented history of my instability would make it easier to redirect the investigation toward me. Rachel's voice in the recording was quieter. She didn't volunteer ideas, but she didn't object to any of it. At one point, Tiffany asked her directly if she was sure. Rachel said yes. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Rachel and asked her to meet me. She chose the restaurant. Whether that was deliberate or unconscious, I couldn't tell. It was the same narrow Italian place on the east side of the city where we had gone on our 3rd date and returned to every anniversary for 7 years. She was already seated when I arrived. She looked tired in the particular way that comes not from lost sleep, but from sustained decision-making, the exhaustion of someone who has been holding a position and is beginning to feel the weight of holding it. I didn't mention the recording. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and asked her one question: why she had let her sister hit me. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at me. Because in 7 years, she said, you never once gave me a reason to stand on your side. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. She believed what she believed, and she had believed it long enough that it had become the foundation she was building everything else on top of. No conversation I could have in that restaurant was going to reach below the foundation. What her answer told me was something I had been slowly understanding since the night of the party, but hadn't fully said to myself. Our marriage hadn't been destroyed by the slap or by the recording or by the forged signature. It had been failing for years, quietly in the space between who I actually was and who she had decided I must be. Every time she changed the subject when Tiffany mocked me, every time she moved a little further toward her family and a little further away from me at the dinner table. Every time she chose not to defend me, she was confirming a conclusion she had already reached. The man she married wasn't worth standing beside. She had been waiting for a moment that would justify what she already felt. She had found it. I drove back to the apartment and told Marcus to accelerate the timeline. The bank had begun asking questions about the loan application on their own, a compliance review triggered by irregularities in the projected cash flow model. When word of the inquiry reached Gavin, he moved quickly. He went to Rachel and told her that the investigation was going to surface my name unless she helped redirect it. He needed her to provide a formal statement confirming that I had been the one to propose using the house as collateral, that I had pushed the project, controlled the accounts, and pressured the family to participate. He framed it as protection. He told her that if she didn't establish a clear narrative now, investigators would assume she was involved. Rachel signed the statement. I don't know how much of what Gavin told her she actually believed. I don't know whether she understood fully what she was doing, or whether she told herself it was a version of the truth close enough to live with. What I know is that her signature appeared on a declaration that named me as the architect of a scheme I had been trying to expose. Combined with the forged documents Gavin's team had already assembled, the picture they presented to financial investigators was coherent enough to open a formal inquiry. I was notified that I was under investigation for wire fraud and money laundering. At the same time, a board member at Northstar, a man named Harold Pewitt, who had been looking for leverage over me for 2 years over a disagreement about the company's direction, discovered through a contact in the financial press that I was under federal scrutiny. He brought it to the board within 48 hours and called for an emergency resolution to suspend my voting rights pending the outcome of the investigation. The motion passed with enough support to be binding. The merger I had spent 14 months structuring was frozen. Northstar's share price dropped in after hours trading the same evening. Marcus called me as I was reading the board resolution. He was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath it. He told me we had options. I told him I needed 24 hours to think. That 24 hours turned out to be shorter than expected. Tiffany had scheduled a public announcement event to celebrate the preliminary approval of the loan. It was held at the same venue as the original party. I think she chose that deliberately. There were journalists invited, local business contacts, members of the Carter Company's management team. It was designed to look like momentum, to look like a family that had weathered a difficult situation with a difficult man and had come out the other side ready to move forward. I was there because Marcus had advised me to document everything in person where possible and because I had a meeting scheduled nearby that I hadn't yet canceled. I was standing near the entrance when the officers arrived. There were 2 of them. They were professional and quiet about it. They approached me without announcing themselves to the room, identified themselves, and began explaining the situation in low voices. But Tiffany saw it happen, and she made a choice. She walked across the room and stopped 3 feet away and watched them put the handcuffs on me in front of every person she had invited to witness her triumph. She leaned close when they were done and said, "There's no one coming for you this time." I didn't look at her. I looked for Rachel. She was standing near the far wall, a glass in her hand. And when my eyes found her, she looked away. Not quickly, not with visible discomfort. She simply turned her attention to something else. The way you redirect your gaze from something that no longer requires your consideration. They walked me out through the main entrance. As we reached the doors, my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. They hadn't taken it yet. I glanced at the screen. It was Marcus. I asked the officers for 30 seconds and they allowed it. Marcus told me that the board suspension had been formalized, that the merger counterparty had issued a notice of delay, and that a story was circulating in the financial press connecting my name to the fraud investigation. The details were thin, but they were out there. Anyone who knew what Northstar Meridian actually was and had been looking for a reason to question its leadership structure had just been handed one. I handed the phone to the officer and got into the car. In the processing room, I sat with my back against the wall and thought through what I had lost in the past 3 weeks. My marriage, my home, my anonymity, my position at the company I had built from the remnants of my father's legacy, and now my freedom, at least temporarily, at least until the arraignment. When they brought me the paperwork to review, there was a second document clipped to the back. Divorce filing. Rachel had timed it, or someone had timed it for her, so that it would reach me here in this room with nowhere to put it except into my own hands. I read through her declaration one more time. The language was precise and detailed and entirely constructed. She had signed her name at the bottom in the same handwriting I had watched form over 7 years of birthday cards and grocery lists, and the small private notes that couples leave each other when they are still for a time trying. I folded the document and set it on the table in front of me. I had spent years protecting a woman who had spent the last several months building a case against me. I had protected her family's livelihood without asking for recognition. I had protected the people who worked for that family without asking for anything at all. And I had protected my silence because I believed at some level that patient people eventually got to tell their own story. Tomorrow, I was going to tell mine. I was released on bail before sunrise. Marcus was waiting outside with a car and a coffee, and the particular expression of a man who has been managing crises long enough to know that the moment just before resolution is always the one that looks most like collapse. He didn't say anything encouraging. He just handed me the coffee and told me we had a hearing in less than 24 hours that would determine whether every asset connected to the investigation would be frozen pending trial. I drank the coffee in the back seat and looked out at the city coming awake around us and thought about what freezing those assets would actually mean. It meant North Star's merger counterparty would walk. 14 months of structuring, negotiation, and positioning gone. It meant the Carter Company's remaining operational accounts would be locked, and the payroll cycle due at the end of the week would not process. The emergency fund I had set up would cover 2 cycles, but not indefinitely. It meant Tiffany and Gavin would have days, possibly more, to move whatever they hadn't already moved before investigators got close enough to stop them. Marcus laid out the options on the drive back. We could continue contesting the charges without revealing my connection to North Star, protect the company's public profile, and manage the hearing through conventional legal defense. It was the conservative path. It was also the path most likely to fail because the evidence Gavin had constructed was designed specifically to withstand conventional defense. The forgeries were professional. Rachel's declaration was signed and detailed. Without context, without the full picture of who I actually was and what I actually owned, a judge looking at those documents would see exactly what Gavin wanted him to see. Or I could tell the truth. Not a partial truth, not a carefully worded disclosure managed through press releases and corporate communications. The full truth in open court on the record in front of the journalists who had been invited to cover what they had been told was a straightforward fraud case involving a financially unstable man and his wife's family business. I told Marcus to prepare for the second option. He nodded once. He had known me long enough to know that when I had already decided something, the conversation about options was a formality I offered out of respect for his counsel. Then we go in with everything, he said. Everything, I confirmed. The hearing room was fuller than I expected. Tiffany had made sure of that. She had contacted at least 2 journalists directly and framed the proceeding as the final chapter in the story she had been telling online for the past several weeks. The volatile, controlling husband finally being held accountable. She was seated across the room when I entered, dressed carefully, posture arranged for an audience. Gavin was beside her. Rachel sat 1 row behind them, slightly apart, as though she hadn't fully committed to the seat she had chosen. The judge opened the proceeding and worked through the preliminary record efficiently. Then he turned to me and asked me to state my occupation and describe the nature of my financial holdings for the court. I stood up. I looked at Rachel first, not at Tiffany, not at the journalists, not at the judge. I looked at Rachel because everything I was about to say had begun with her. With 7 years of choosing to believe that silence was the same thing as safety, That patience was the same thing as a plan. She met my eyes for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands. "My name is Damian Reed," I said. "I am the founder and controlling beneficial owner of North Star Meridian Group. As of this quarter, the group's total asset value exceeds $50 billion. The room didn't erupt. It went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that requires a moment to actually process. I watched it move across people's faces. The journalist nearest the aisle, the court clerk, the associate attorney sitting to Tiffany's left. A kind of recalibration, a sudden reassessment of everything they thought they were watching. Tiffany's expression didn't change immediately. She had the controlled face of someone waiting to find out whether what she had just heard was something she needed to respond to. I continued. The first thing I established was the property. The house that Elaine had changed the locks on, the house that Rachel's family had been treating as Carter family territory for the past several weeks. Marcus' team placed the trust documentation before the judge. The house had been purchased and placed in trust 4 years before Rachel and I married. It had never been Rachel's asset. It had never been available as collateral for anyone. The application to use it as security for the loan had been built on a foundation that did not legally exist. Tiffany shifted in her seat. The second disclosure was the history. I had Marcus' team present the financial records, the restructured debt facility that had kept the Carter Company solvent years earlier, the medical payments that had covered Elaine's extended care, the bridge loan that had carried Tiffany's first restaurant through its opening year. Every transaction traced back through the holding entities to accounts I controlled. The anonymous investor the Carter family had thanked no one for was standing in their courtroom. He had been standing in their living room for 7 years. He had sat at the far end of their table and listened to them talk about him as though he were invisible. Gavin's attorney was on his feet. The judge told him to sit down. The third piece was the fraud itself. Marcus placed the signature analysis before the court, a forensic document examination conducted by an independent firm that North Star retained for exactly these situations. The signature on the loan authorization document was not mine. The variance analysis was precise and unambiguous. Alongside it, we presented the corporate registry documentation for the 4 entities Gavin had established as consulting fronts, the wire transfer records showing funds moving from prior project accounts into those entities, and the financial disclosure from the private collection proceeding that documented the gambling debts the loan proceeds were intended to service. Gavin was no longer looking at the front of the room. The fourth thing I put before the court was Rachel's role. I didn't editorialize. I didn't characterize it. Marcus presented the metadata from the documents she had sent to Tiffany, the timestamps, the file formats, the email headers showing point of origin, her personal account, sent over a period of several months. My identification documents, my electronic signature file, property records that should never have left my possession. She had not been coerced into providing them. She had gathered them deliberately and transferred them to her sister while continuing to live in our shared home and behave as though the marriage was simply struggling. Then Marcus played the recording. I had asked him to let it play in full without interruption. The judge allowed it. The room listened to Tiffany's voice working through the logistics of what she intended to do at the party, the escalation, the expected reaction, the video, the divorce advantage, and then Rachel's voice quieter, answering the direct question. "Are you sure?" A pause. "Yes." When it finished, the room was very still. Tiffany looked for the first time like someone who understood that the story had changed in a way she couldn't rewrite. Gavin didn't make it to the end of the day. He left the courthouse during a recess and was detained at the international terminal of the airport 4 hours later. The bag he was carrying contained a laptop and a portable drive with documentation for 3 offshore accounts. The accounts held a combined balance consistent with what had been systematically extracted from the Carter Company over the preceding 2 years. He was arrested on the concourse before his flight began boarding. The criminal referrals came quickly after that. Tiffany faced charges on 5 counts: document forgery, bank fraud, embezzlement, criminal defamation, and obstruction of a financial investigation. The case against her was not complicated. The records were clean, and the recording was unambiguous, and she had at several points been precisely clear about her intentions in ways that a good attorney might have told her not to be. Rachel's situation was more complicated because her exposure was real, but her role had been secondary and to some degree exploited by people who understood how to use her. She ultimately cooperated with investigators, fully provided access to every communication, every document, every conversation she could recall or reconstruct. The cooperation agreement reduced her exposure significantly. She received a suspended sentence and a restitution order covering her share of the funds tied to the fraudulent filings. She would not serve time. She would spend several years paying back money she had helped someone else take. I did not contest the leniency of her agreement. I was asked through legal channels whether I had any objection to the terms. I said I did not. Whatever Rachel had done, I was not going to be the person who argued for a harsher outcome. The board resolution at North Star was overturned within the week. With the criminal referrals public and the investigation pointing clearly away from me, Harold Pewitt found himself explaining to the full board why he had acted on unverified information with enough urgency to freeze the company's most significant pending deal. The explanation was not persuasive. The merger counterparty, after careful communication from our investor relations team, agreed to extend the exclusivity window. The deal moved forward. The Carter Company required a different kind of intervention. I could have walked away entirely, let the creditors sort out the wreckage, and accepted that the jobs would be lost as a natural consequence of what had been done. Instead, I had North Star's private equity arm acquire the outstanding debt, remove the Carter family from all operational and governance roles permanently, and installed a professional management team with a mandate to stabilize and restructure. The employees would be protected, the business could recover. The family that had run it into the ground while I quietly kept it alive would have no further role in deciding its future. The transition took 60 days. I was told the employees were informed on a Tuesday morning that the ownership had changed, that there would be no layoffs tied to the transition, and that the plan going forward was focused on sustainable growth. I was also told that a number of people across those facilities had figured out over the course of those 60 days that the company's anonymous historical benefactor and the man whose name they had been seeing in the news were the same person. I don't know exactly how they felt about that. I hope it was something close to fair. Rachel found me 3 weeks after the sentencing hearing. I was in my actual office in the building I actually owned in the role I had actually held for nearly 2 decades, built from the foundation my father had left behind, and everything I had added on top of it in the years since. She asked my assistant if I had a few minutes. I told my assistant to send her in. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at the room the way a person looks at a space that makes them understand something they should have understood a long time ago. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry. She said she had let her family tell her who I was for so long that she had eventually stopped asking herself whether any of it was true. She said she didn't expect anything from me. She just needed me to know that she understood. Now, I listened to all of it. Then I told her the truth as simply as I could. You didn't lose me when you found out what I was worth. I said, you lost me the night you watched someone hit me and decided that was the side of the room you wanted to be on. She nodded slowly. She didn't argue with it. She thanked me for the time and walked out, and I watched the door close behind her, and I sat with the quiet for a moment before I picked up the file I had been reading and went back to work. A year later, I stood at the launch of a fund I had structured to support people who had experienced financial abuse, coercive control, and defamation within domestic and family relationships. People who had been systematically discredited, isolated, or had their identities used against them by the people closest to them. I didn't give a long speech. I said that I had spent a significant portion of my life believing that the safest version of myself was the one nobody could see clearly. I said I had been wrong about that, not because visibility had protected me, but because invisibility had allowed other people to define me completely, and I had let that happen for far too long. Tiffany was serving her sentence. Gavin was in a federal facility awaiting a second set of proceedings tied to the offshore accounts. Rachel was working at a nonprofit across the city, and from what I understood, building something quieter and more honest than anything she had built before. Some weeks after the fund launched, I walked past the Italian restaurant on the east side of the city, the one where we had spent our third date in 7 anniversaries. The lights were on inside. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked through the window at the tables and the people seated at them, strangers living their ordinary evenings. Then I kept walking. Later that same evening, I drove past the venue where the party had been held. I parked and went inside. The space was between events empty, the chairs stacked along the walls. I walked to the table near the center of the room where I had stood that night. The surface was bare. Nothing remained of what had been placed there or taken away. I didn't stay long. I walked back out into the night air and got into my car. Not the old car I used to drive when I was performing a version of myself designed to be overlooked. A different car. One that didn't announce anything either, but for different reasons now. Not because I was hiding, but because I had never particularly needed the things that loud objects are meant to signal. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed home, not to the house in the trust which I had transferred to a charitable housing organization. Home was somewhere smaller, quieter, and entirely mine, not as a secret, but simply as a place where I lived. I had spent years building something worth $50 billion and 7 years pretending it didn't exist. And what I had learned from all of it was not a lesson about wealth or power or the way people treat you when they think you have neither. What I had learned was simpler and harder than any of that. The most expensive thing I ever did was stay quiet to keep the peace. The most valuable thing I ever did was finally speak. If this story stayed with you, maybe because you've been underestimated by someone who should have known better or because you've stayed quiet in a situation where you should have spoken, I want you to know that you're not alone in that. Stories like this one exist because that experience is more common than people admit. If you found value in being here today, consider subscribing. Every week, I bring you a new story about people who were counted out, written off, or pushed to the edge, and what happened when they finally decided to stop hiding who they really were. I'll see you in the next.